At 8,000 feet, the wind struck differently. In November of 1834, Jonas Fletcher discovered that his first November in the Wind River Valley, when his water bucket froze solid 3 feet from the fireplace and ice crystals appeared on the interior of his cabin walls. He had constructed the cabin in the same manner as all other trappers in the Rocky Mountains. Mud-packed, logs tightly placed, typical build, with a stone fireplace at one end and between the gaps. Everyone did. That manner. He consumed more firewood than any 3 men combined by February. Ought to be required during winter. Split logs had left his hands raw. He had a backache from carrying them, and the cold continued to permeate those walls as if they were composed of paper. Even worse, when spring, that same cabin became an oven when it eventually arrived and the valley warmed. The sturdy timber walls that were unable to support winter warmth somehow retained all of the summer heat, making it impossible to sleep and transforming the house into a sweatbox. Jonas wasn't the only one with this issue. Each and every settler, trapper, and the harsh reality was the same for frontiersmen erecting huts in the highlands. The conventional cabin layout that was effective. The tremendous temperature variations of the highlands made the relatively good conditions in the fields and eastern woodlands almost uninhabitable. Summer temperatures could reach 90 degrees. Winter evenings got as low as 30 degrees. The both needed to be handled by the same structure, and conventional building techniques were more likely to fail at that task than they accomplished. Over the following 3 years, Jonas's findings would subtly permeate the mountain towns of the Rockies, altering the way early settlers and trappers constructed their winter homes. He didn't create any of the distinct methods. For decades, a variety of techniques had been used, adapted from various sources, but Jonas brought them together in a particular manner that tackled the particular difficulties of living at a high altitude. As a result, the cabin used less fuel and remained substantially warmer in the winter and cooler in the summer, delivering genuine consolation in situations that typically provided none. The narrative of a Shoshone woman who believed that white men constructed absurd homes, a Swedish trapper, and Jonas's own obstinate refusal to endure another summer of oppressive heat or another winter of cold temperatures. It concerns knowing how heat truly passes through a structure, about using materials found in the natural, also the distinction between creating a hut and a house that you can live in for many years. Jonas, there was nothing unique about Fletcher. Born in 1809 in Virginia, he had previously worked as a prior to being drawn west by the fur trade. He was a carpenter's apprentice. He joined a brigade of trappers en route to the Rockies in 1833, among the group of young guys who had previously been hunting beaver pelts. The transaction fell through. More than most trappers could say, he had some building experience, but he knew not log huts, but board structure with timber framing. His initial building in the Wind River Valley was a reflection of that lack of experience. With a nearby cool spring, timber, and a good southern exposure for the most winter sun, he had chosen a good location, close enough to avoid hurting his back when hauling wood. Some protection from the worst was offered by the valley walls. Winds. All of the practical factors were in order. However, when it came to actually constructing the cabin, Jonas made every error a novice could. Late in the summer, he cut his logs, while sap was still operating. Didn't adequately season them. Stacked them without the bark removed because seemed like more labor. Utilized whatever chinking material was available, such as moss from the shady area and clay from the creek bank. Regions with vegetation even crammed into the larger spaces. Since the ground was located on the north wall, he built his fireplace there, flattest. Proud of his quickness, he completed the entire project in 3 weeks. That cabin taught him valuable lessons through hardship. As they dried, the unseasoned logs shrank, creating spaces between them that no amount of chinking might fill in forever. Because the bark retained moisture, rot, and giving insects a place to live. The first hard winter caused the clay chinking to break and then crumble. The moss dried out and disintegrated into pieces. Mice used the grass-filled spaces as roads, and the fireplace in the north wall, meaning that while the living area remained cold, the warmth from the fire moved toward the cabin's coldest area. However, the worst issue was initially something Jonas was unable to perceive or comprehend. There was no thermal mass within the cabin. Insulated package. The exterior wall was pressed up against the stone fireplace, thus half its heat radiated to the outside in vain. Heat was dissipated more quickly by the log walls themselves than by the fireplace might take its place. During the coldest evenings, Jonas could actually see the inside of the walls, even though the fire was still burning fiercely. When summer arrived, The heat from the day was absorbed and released by the same walls, all night making it impossible to fall asleep. During that first winter, Jonas burned 4 cords of wood 3 times a month. How long it ought to have taken. The cottage was intolerable, so he slept on the ground outside throughout the summer. He was aware that there was a fundamental flaw in the way he had constructed the place, but he was unable to identify it. The response began gathering in the fall of 1835, after Niels, a Swedish trapper, Bergstrom drove through the valley and paused at Jonas's cabin. Niels had one of the old-timers who had seen and survived it all, having lived in the highlands since the early 1820s. He examined Jonas's cabin with the skillful eye of someone who was fully aware of what he was looking at. "You're chilly." "Here," Niels said. There was no question. Jonas made no effort to refute it. "Colder, I don't know why, but logs are generally tight and have a nice fireplace." Niels strolled around the structure, examining it from many perspectives. He applied pressure to a few of the timbers, examined the chinking and the placement of the fireplace. He shook his head at last. "Your cabin has been constructed backwards. Instead of warming the floor inside, you've caused the fire to warm the ground outside. Your walls are home to the cold, rather than remaining outside where it belongs." That meant nothing to Jonas. Niels explained it in the direct manner of someone who had discovered these ideas via trial and error. He claimed that heat traveled in particular ways. Hot surfaces emitted it like a sunworm stone or fire. It moved more quickly through some materials than others, compared to others, and it increased, which is why any cabin ceiling remained warmer than its floor. The issue with all of these heat movements were detrimental to Jonas's cabin. Half of the warmth emanated from the fireplace, to the wall outside, which transferred that heat directly outside. The ascent Jonas had not adequately sealed the cracks along the roofline, allowing heat to escape. The log walls appeared sturdy, behaved as moderate conductors in reality. They're not bad insulators, but they're also not good ones. And there was no mass in the cabin. When the fire subsided, they went inside to keep warm. "In the past," Neil stated, "you construct the heat storage inside. We learned how to stay warm a long time ago. The fireplace should be in the middle of the house, not outside. Contacting the outer walls, the warm air must envelop the mass of stone in order for it to retain and impart that warmth." He continued by explaining that the greatest lodges he had seen in the Rockies were constructed by trappers who, typically after enduring several winters, had learned from their mistakes. Placed fireplaces inside if at all possible, or at the very least, constructed them with substantial mass that extended into the living area. In the coldest regions, they constructed double walls, 2 layers of logs with moss or packed earth in between for insulation, and they properly chinked each opening. They constructed using appropriately seasoned timbers that wouldn't shrink and supplies that wouldn't break or fall out. Jonas listened intently and had already begun organizing his second. Niels told him that the cabin will be constructed before the next winter arrived. Defied the conventional knowledge he had previously adhered to, but that conventional wisdom had left him feeling cold and wretched. He made the decision to try something new. The second piece of information was discovered in an unexpected place. In the same fall, Morning Crow, a Chaussonnier lady, and her husband, a French-Canadian, passed through the valley. Trapper Baptiste Moreau. They made a trade stop at Jonas's hut, and Morning Crow giggled after glancing at his arrangement. "White men build cold houses," she remarked in a blend of English, French, and Chaussonnier were the primary tongues of the mountain commerce. "You construct walls that exhale warmth as an elderly person exhales life." Jonas was growing weary of all, though he was told that his cabin was awful. He was also astute enough to pay attention when someone who had survived Morning Crow stated that her people didn't build with logs the way this country's winters did. When white trappers constructed winter-proof homes, they employed what she referred to as 2 skins. And the idea was straightforward. Air or insulating material was trapped between an inner wall and an exterior wall. As long as it remained stationary, it was a decent insulator. It trapped air between 2 barriers, couldn't remove heat, but if you had a single wood wall, the air was directly in contact with each other on both sides. Contacting the wood, permitting continuous heat transfer. Install a second barrier with trapped air in between, and you significantly decrease the heat transfer. Morning Crow explained how her people made use of woven mats, bark, or hides to construct double-layered shelters. She described how, in the coldest areas, they excavated lodges partially underground, insulating with the soil itself. She also pointed out something Jonas hadn't thought of. A building may be made to adapt to the changing seasons. keeping you cool in the summer and warm in the winter if you knew how the sun movement and the flow of air. You want the hot air to go out in the summer, she explained. Create shade on the sunny side and high openings for the hot air to travel through. In the winter, you keep the hot air inside by closing the upper apertures. Maintain the warmth of the ground beneath your floor, rather than letting it escape outdoors. For the remainder of that fall and the first part of winter, Jonas reflected on all that Niels and Morning Crow had taught him. Considered the various routes that heat can move, the trapping of air, and the placement of the fireplace where its he considered double walls and appropriate materials. And he considered the idea that warmth would remain within, rather than escape. Regarding his experience in carpentry, which equipped him with abilities that most trappers lacked. By December, he had figured out a design for a new cabin, starting from fresh and applying all he had learned. The next summer would be devoted to the construction, but it would be worthwhile to have a building that truly Jonah began cutting logs in the late fall of 1835 when the Asap began to flow. Working with the mountain climate rather than against it, he chopped twice as many logs as he would have needed for a typical cabin because the wood would season better once he had retreated. He allowed the logs to sit through the winter, stacked with spacers, and his design called for double walls in key places between them to let air flow. He started building in the spring, once the wood had largely dried out. The floor and foundation were the first significant changes. Jonas's original cottage had been situated directly on the ground. The new design included stone foundation peaks at the corners and midpoints of the packed dirt floor, creating a crawl by lifting the entire construction roughly 2 feet above the ground. It was a multi-purpose area that protected the bottom logs from rot and ground moisture and acted as a buffer of air between the living area and the chilly ground, enabling Jonas to keep things that needed to stay cool in summer, but shielded from bitter cold in the winter. The floor was constructed puncheons made from split logs or placed flat side up over substantial support timbers. Constructed a real wood floor, which offered superior insulation from the elements and was far warmer underfoot than packed earth, cold underneath. The density of the wood floor and the air gap in the crawl area formed a thermal buffer that kept notably warmer living space. The second significant modification was to the walls themselves. Jonas constructed the primary structure made of big, precisely matched logs, each of which debarked and had its top and bottom hewn flat. Communicated with one another. Compared to round logs, this required more effort, but it produced reduced gaps and significantly tighter joints. But he didn't stop there. In addition to the north and west walls, which confronted the dominant winter winds, Jonas constructed a second wall 2 feet within the main wall. The 2-foot space between the walls was constructed from smaller logs that were similarly hewn flat, containing a variety of items, including dried moss at the bottom, a thick covering of dried leaves and forest debris, then more moss, followed by a last layer of clay and grass. The goal was to produce several layers of insulating material and trapped air. The east and south walls did not receive the complete double wall treatment since they were exposed to the winter light and had milder temperatures. But Jonas completed these walls considerably more meticulously than his initial cabin, following a particular formula he had created. A layer of tiny bits of split wood that were firmly pushed into the spaces, followed by a clay, sand, and cow hair concoction, which he exchanged for a bag of hair trimmings from Down Valley. At a settler's ranch, the hair strengthened the clay and kept it from cracking. While the clay supplied the seal and the sand offered structure, Jonas added another component to his chinking mix: lime. Another trapper had taught him that adding a tiny bit of lime to it was more resilient to cracking and water damage because of the clay chinking. The lime produced a gentle chemical reaction that strengthened the combination and increased its durability. But Jonas was aware of the results of chemistry, yet his chinking with its wood backing and the blend of lime-enhanced clay and sand hair shown exceptional durability during weather and temperature fluctuations. The fireplace and chimney were the third significant change. Jonas placed his fireplace in the interior, around 4 feet from the north, rather than against the exterior wall. He used carefully chosen flat stones to construct the hearth and stove, rounded river stones for the upper structure and ones for the firebox floor, although the mass was the main characteristic. Jonas constructed the fireplace structure considerably larger than was strictly required for the firebox itself. The broad, thick stone chimney produced substantial thermal mass within the cabin. He created spaces by extending stone benches from either side of the fireplace to sit, which further functioned as extra heat-storing mass. The overall structure likely weighed 4 or 5 tons of stone, all of which were placed within the hut so that the heat it had accumulated would radiate into the living area. The design idea was simple. After an hour or two of a hot fire, heating all that stone, which absorbed the heat and then gradually released it over the course of the following 8 to 10 hours, meant that the cabin would remain warm if Jonas let the fire to burn down to coals or perhaps go out entirely. Radiating heat of the stone mass. He had essentially constructed a battery for warmth, replenishing it on a regular basis instead of keeping a steady fire going. Another ingenious feature was the chimney itself, which Jonas constructed with a little slant roughly 5 feet over the firebox, creating a trap for rising smoke and heat, making it come into contact with more stone surface before leaving, which improved the extraction of heat from the A-stone damper near the top, smoke and less warm air escaping up the chimney, which, when the fire was low, Jonas could partially close, preventing heat loss while permitting smoke to escape. Seasonal adaptation and ventilation were the fourth major component, and Jonas constructed tiny apertures. On the east and west walls, close to the roofline, they remained closed during the winter with wood plugs installed and sealed. Using clay, he took out the plugs in the summer so that hot air could naturally ascend out of the cottage, creating air. He also constructed the roof differently than a typical cabin, creating a flow that made summer heat considerably more tolerable. The roofs of the majority of trappers' cottages were low-pitched and hardly shed water. Jonas constructed a steeper pitch which provided several functions, including reducing the accumulation of hazardous loads by better shedding snow in the winter. A steeper angle added an insulating air gap by increasing the distance between the roofline and the ceiling, which enabled him to cover the split wood shingles with a layer of sod, adding more thermal mass and insulation. Jonas laid split roofs which were modified for the mountain environment and had been utilized by settlers on the plains. After laying cedar shakes as the foundation, cover them with several inches of clay to act as a moisture barrier, and then add a thick layer of healthy soil that is secured at the eaves by wooden frameworks. Grass in this soil was bound together by the roots of wildflowers that bloomed there, creating a living roof that provided insulation. Insulation retained winter warmth within the cabin by absorbing summer heat before it could enter. The fifth element, 2 windows and the south wall. Jonas constructed his cottage with 2 windows and the main door facing south. The winter sun. The windows had small, costly, and delicate glass, but oriented to maximize light in the winter months when the sun is low in the sky. And in the summer months when the sun is high in the sky, these windows were shaded by wooden awnings, which prevented the interior from overheating. Jonas placed a stone block around 3 inches thick underneath each window inside. As the sun warmed them, they absorbed winter sunlight during the day and extended several feet into the room. Through the evening and night, that heat was stored and released. This passive solar heating, in conjunction with the thermal because of the fireplace's bulk, Jonas required far less firewood to stay comfortable during the new cabin's construction. Captured Jonas for the majority of the 1836 summer. Other trappers traveling through the valley observed his development with curiosity and suspicion. A double-walled building didn't seem essential. Construction. In contrast to the typical end-wall arrangement, the enormous inside fireplace appeared odd. The saw roof drew specific remarks. The majority of trappers believed it would collapse or leak. Jonas disregarded the doubters and continued his job. He had completed enough of the building by early September to move in, but he spent the following few weeks finishing details and adjusting the chinking. In October, the first actual test was conducted when nighttime temperatures in the valley dropped below 0 due to an early cold snap. Jonas lighted his fireplace in the afternoon, constructing a blazing fire that burned for around 2 hours, heating the stone mass rising, filling the cabin with warmth. By dusk, when the fire had subsided to coals, the interior Jonas didn't need his bulky coat because the weather was obviously comfortable, something that had never been true in his old cabin. He went to sleep after letting the fire die out entirely at midnight, and upon waking up at the crack of dawn, the cabin wasn't nearly as cold as it should have been, but his breath was still creating mist. The stone fireplace was still warm to the touch. There was no frost on the inside of the walls. The temperature had undoubtedly decreased, but much more slowly than in his previous building. Jonas rekindled the fire, and the cabin was warm in half an hour. Once more. The true test occurred in January as the bitter cold rolled in, with temperatures falling to 30 degrees below. For a few days in a row, Jonas lit his fireplace's regular hot fire for a couple of hours every afternoon and evening. after which allow it to subside overnight. The double walls kept the cold out, and the enormous stone building provided warmth. From entering from the north and west, the elevated floor kept the ground level, and the tight chinking prevented drafts. Jonas burnt less than half of the firewood he had used the previous winter, yet the cabin remained cold from seeping up. Far more comfortable. He could sleep without wearing gloves, and he could work on tasks indoors without blanket he possessed. The distinction was so striking that other trappers who came by wanted to know right away. The Wind River Valley and beyond heard about what he'd done differently, and more trappers started using Jonas's methods to their own cabins. Some employed the double wall design, while others concentrated on, in order to generate thermal mass indoors, the majority began moving their fires. Employing his chinking recipe, which turned up to be more resilient than the conventional clay and moss method. The particular mixture. Various methods differed according to the requirements of each individual, the resources at hand, and the construction abilities, but the fundamental principles don't change. By 1838, a number of cabins in the valley had modifications on Jonas's design. Remy, a French-Canadian trapper, constructed a hybrid building that saves work and provides substantial insulation by simply having double walls on the north side. Advantages. Two brothers from Kentucky constructed their cabin's fireplace, dead center, forming a stone mass so big that it remained heated for more than 24 hours after the fire was extinguished. An older Samuels, a trapper, renovated his pre-existing cabin using the sod roof technique, stating that it significantly improved comfort in both the summer and the winter. The summer advantages of Jonas's. During the sweltering months of 1837, the design became clear. Other cottages became ovens, but because the saw ceiling absorbed heat before it could enter, Jonas's structure remained substantially cooler. Heat was kept from escaping through the wall's trapped air layers, and the large ventilation apertures permitted the stone fireplace, which was no longer utilized for heating, actually assisted in cooling the room by allowing hot air to escape. By gradually absorbing summer heat, the enormous stone prevented temperature spikes and remained cool throughout the winter. Jonas found that by opening his door early in the morning, when the outside air was cooler, he could improve the cooling throughout the summer. Coolest, allowing the cooler air to enter and push out the heated air within. He would shut everything off in the middle of the morning, trapping the chilly air inside the fireplace and walls. Eventually managed to keep the interior cool during the sweltering afternoon. He would then repeat the procedure in the evening, removing stored heat and introducing refreshing nighttime air. The passive climate. For a design developed without any formal engineering expertise, control performed remarkably well. Jonas had just observed the flow of heat, took advice from those who had found alternative solutions to related issues, and integrated those lessons into a useful design, resulting in a cabin with comparatively constant interior temperatures. Despite sharp fluctuations outside, other ideas proliferated throughout the mountain. During this time, some trappers began constructing towns, though Jonas did not claim credit for all of them. Logs are arranged vertically instead of horizontally, resulting in fewer horizontal. Others experimented with other roof designs, constructing steeper pitches or joints where water may gather, constructing linked shed constructions on the north side of their cottages, adding ventilated attic areas, and extra windbreaks. The subterranean cellar became another typical element. However, Jonas hadn't included one in his first plan. Excavated into the slope behind or next to a cottage, these cellars kept temperatures extremely consistent throughout the year, keeping food chilly in the summer and comparatively warm in some trappers even excavated cellars immediately beneath their homes, which were accessible by a trapdoor, which made the living area and the frozen ground even more insulated. By the early 1840s, as the many trappers fled the highlands when the beaver trade collapsed, and the ability to construct climate-adapted houses had dispersed throughout the towns of the Rocky Mountains, and settlers frequently discovered trappers' houses with these elements were already included, and they used the approaches for their own building, continuing developing more advanced ventilation systems, better chinking formulas, and better fireplace designs. Jonas Fletcher resided in the Wind River Valley until 1843, but the fundamental ideas remained. He had grown to love the valley and the mountains, where he had learned his difficult lessons, but the fur trade was dwindling. About building cabins. He later married Morning Crow's cousin, a Shoshone woman, and they had 3 kids together. He earned a living in that meticulously constructed home by utilizing his expertise to lead settlers over the mountain passes. The cabin itself stood for more than 40 years, Having been acquired during his trapping years, endured the rigors of everyday use, innumerable winter storms, and summer heat waves. In the 1860s, Jonas finally gave it up to be nearer to one of his grown children. The structure was still made of strong logs that were holding fast with chinking. As sturdy as the day he had constructed it, the stone fireplace was utilized by other inhabitants for years later, acknowledging the caliber of its creation. The methods Jonas created and disseminated weren't revolutionary in the sense that it is completely new. Proper chinking, inner thermal mass, double wall construction, passive ventilation. Each of these techniques was used in a different way in different buildings. Customs were combined by Jonas especially for the harsh environment of high-altitude mountains. Living, incorporating indigenous building techniques, Scandinavian log building knowledge, and practical woodworking. The true breakthrough was realizing that a cabin didn't have to be a log box. It could be created to intelligently store and release warmth, cooperate with natural heat fluxes, and adjust to seasonal. This necessitated an understanding of the fundamentals of conduction, convection, and radiation and heat transmission. Even though Jonas was unfamiliar with those formal words, he was able to understand them via experience and observation, from his own errors as well as from those who had previously resolved comparable issues in other settings. Contemporary thermal engineering would ultimately explain the success of Jonas's design. The double walls produced insulation using several layers of material and trapped air, with the internal thermal mass acting as a thermal battery, releasing energy when required and storing it when available. Temperature fluctuations were moderated by the roof's insulation and thermal bulk, and the raised floor prevented ground coupling heat loss. Seasonal adaptation was made possible by the ventilation system. Each component had a particular thermal function, regardless of Jonas's comprehension of the science. The effects of these construction methods went beyond personal comfort. Better insulated huts needed less firewood, which reduced the amount of time spent on the hazardous and taxing task of chopping and moving logs. More time for settlers and trappers to engage in other pursuits, such as cultivating their land, caring for livestock, or just relaxing. Reduced usage of firewood also meant reduced strain on nearby woods, which were already suffering from excessive use. Better health results might also have resulted from warmer, cozier cabins. Constant exposure to cold as Jonas strained the body and made him more susceptible to respiratory ailments during his first winter. Cabins that warmer temps kept things more stable and less stressful, but frontier life was still tough and risky. Minor enhancements to everyday living circumstances could add up to significant variations in survival and quality of life. It's also important to note how Jonas's ideas have benefited society by freely sharing his methods. He helped establish a custom of mutual assistance and information sharing with other trappers and settlers that typified mountain cultures, and constructing a functional cabin was the difference between surviving and dying. Because everyone's life relied on it, people shared survival skills over the winter and froze to death. Jonas's willingness to share his techniques rather than keep them a secret in order to help others comprehend the ideas mirrored the cooperative way of life on the frontier. A few of the trappers who studied under Jonas later constructed huts in other areas, further disseminating the methods. Later, in 1838, a group of trappers spent the winter in the valley, constructed cottages using the double wall construction in Montana Territory. People moving to Oregon country and occasionally visited the Wind River Valley in the early 1840s and got guidance on cabin construction from Jonas and others. The information spread over time via the unofficial networks that linked mountain villages over thousands of miles, and the particular methods likewise kept evolving to various conditions and materials. Where stone was in short supply, builders utilized thick packed earth or adobe bricks. For thermal mass, they used thicker layers of insulation and smaller logs in places with scarce timber. The designs changed in response to altered precipitation, less drastic temperature fluctuations, or changing climate patterns. The fundamental ideas persisted, but the way they were applied differed according to regional circumstances and the resources available. Resources. Over the years, Jonas himself kept improving his strategy. In the late 1830s, he expanded his growing space by adding a tiny linked greenhouse to the south side of his hut. He tried several chinking techniques to give extra passive warmth in the winter and to season for plants. Ingredients, ultimately deciding on a formula that called for tallow and trace amounts to provide water resistance. He constructed it to avoid needlessly heating the cabin during hot weather. A second stone fireplace for summer cooking is situated outdoors. Weather. Jonas's home had become somewhat of a valley showpiece by the time he was in his 50s. and guests frequently remarked on how cozy it was in comparison to other constructions. And although others attempted to purchase it from him, Jonas consistently refused to give it up because he had worked too hard and learnt too much from it. The cabin symbolized not only a place to stay, but also a wealth of information and expertise. The larger background of cabin design in the American. This demonstrates how Jonas's work was a component of a broader development in construction methods during the 1800s. Over time, settlers and builders improved their techniques for producing cozy, long-lasting buildings in difficult conditions. Due to the quick westward migration, people were continuously constructing in new climates and using unknown materials, necessitating creativity and adaptability. Regional differences in cabin design represented many environmental issues. Because of the rainy climate in the Pacific Northwest, builders concentrated on keeping moisture out, harm from elevated foundations and steep roofs. In the arid, scorching Southwest, thermal bulk and insulation were provided by large adobe walls. In the Great Plains, where lumber was limited, settlers constructed sodus, which uses the ground itself for insulation and structure, created techniques tailored to its unique circumstances. Jonas's contribution was unique to high-altitude mountains, conditions characterized by long, cold winters and sharp temperature fluctuations. Strategies successfully handled those specific issues without the need for costly supplies or sophisticated equipment. Over the course of a summer, one individual with rudimentary carpentry abilities might construct the design. Because the methods were easily accessible, trappers and settlers in need of workable remedies quickly adopted them. Not complex construction. Generations of children carried on the tradition of this useful building knowledge, who learned the design concepts from their upbringing in well-built cabins and applied those lessons to their own constructing projects, sometimes refining their knowledge and other times making things simpler for certain situations. Building techniques were passed down orally, thus even in the absence of written records, the knowledge remained relevant and flexible. Documents. For many years, a few of Jonas's direct ancestors remained in the Rocky Mountain area. Grandchildren narrated tales of their grandfather's hut, which provided warmth during the winter months without, whether they completely comprehended the one with the enormous stone fireplace and the sod roof. The one with the burning mountains of firewood either recognized that Grandpa built it cleverly or understood the thermal physics involved. Matter. The knowledge endured in the shape of successful procedures, effective structures, and instructive anecdotes. In the 1850s and thereafter, the shift from the trapping era to settled agriculture introduced novel methods for construction, but many of the techniques learned from the days of trapping were still applicable. Farmers and ranchers constructing long-term, because mountain dwellings were still subject to drastic weather fluctuations, they still need buildings that remained warm in winter and chilly summer. The particular methods changed. Sawmills produced the availability of dimensional lumber, manufactured supplies, and improved equipment allowed for greater complex construction, but the core ideas of addressing climate change rather than combating it persisted. Relevant. Reconstructed mountainmen cabins and trappers. Cabins are occasionally seen by contemporary tourists at historic sites. Homes. These constructions frequently fall short of the more sophisticated models. A basic log box. Having a fireplace at one end creates a show that looks realistic, but it doesn't reflect the sophisticated designs that mountainmen actually constructed after learning from difficult experiences. The distinction between a first-year trapper's hut and the building he had constructed after the 5 mountain winters were dramatic. Jonas Fletcher's particular cabin, that expertly constructed building in the Wind River Valley, which was abandoned in the 1860s and gradually fell into ruin due to weather and time took their toll, with the exposed wooden structure collapsing after the sod roof started to decay, leaving only the stone fireplace standing by the turn of the century, standing a tribute to the portion of the building that was actually meant to last, though even that was finally buried by growing vegetation and shifting soil. But the information Jonas created and disseminated endured long after the actual structure disappeared. Mountain people, settlers, and trappers throughout the Rockies kept employing methods that traced due in part to the difficult lessons that were acquired in that valley during the 1830s. Decades later, few individuals remembered the location of a particular structure since credit was lost. Techniques had been developed, but what mattered was that the techniques themselves kept functioning. The narrative emphasizes something significant about creativity and information exchange in frontier environments. Significant discoveries weren't always made from skilled engineers or expert constructors. Occasionally, the most beneficial inventions came from perceptive individuals, ready to listen to a variety of knowledge sources, learn from failures, and try new things until they find what works solutions. Jonas's integration of native construction expertise, Swedish log-building principles, and it also illustrates how practical carpentry produced something more efficient than any one tradition alone. In many situations, Jonas's original cabin would have been sufficient, but environmental constraints demanded adaptation. It was hardly habitable in the harsh Wind River Valley environment at 8,000 feet. The particular situation required better answers, forcing Jonas to use his imagination and blend several strategies. Necessity drove creativity, as it so frequently does. The key takeaway from Jonas Fletcher's work is that structures may be made to. It's still important to cooperate with the climate rather than just fight it. Contemporary green. Similar concepts apply to the construction of passive houses and buildings. Use thermal mass to strategically store and release heat. Make insulated envelopes to stop heat transfer. And plan for natural. The concepts of orienting structures to benefit from passive solar heating and ventilation, when appropriate, are not new, even though they articulated these ideas differently than contemporary engineers. Mountain men in the 1830s understood them. Jonas had a much longer life than usual, passing away in 1881 at the age of 72. Mountain men of his time. He had observed the rise and fall of the beaver trade. He had seen how he had witnessed railroads slicing through valleys where only game routes led, transforming the mountain wilderness into populated area. Had existed. He recalled those early winters in the past despite all those changes. Wind River Valley, discovering the hard way how to construct a functional lodge. As he grew older, Jonas. Occasionally, when inexperienced builders sought him help on building cabins, he would impart his knowledge, explaining regarding correct chinking, seasonal ventilation, thermal mass, and double walls. Some people paid close attention. Others bowed courteously and constructed whatever was most convenient and quick. But Jonas didn't care because he had discovered that before making the effort to construct, people needed to be sufficiently chilly and burn enough additional fuel. However, the benefits were immediate and long-lasting for those who paid attention and put the concepts into practice. A cabin that kept warm in the winter without using too much firewood. A building that kept cool in the summer without needing ongoing care. The true home was one that cooperated with the environment rather than battling it. Innovation, realizing that a structure may serve as a tool for more than just protecting against the weather, regulating the climate, providing comfort, and perhaps simplifying survival. Methods that Jonas Fletcher created and disseminated were a compilation of knowledge from several sources, modified to certain circumstances via trial and error. They weren't flawless fixes, no construction technique is, but they were greatly superior to the typical method that the majority of trappers employed. And that enhancement, multiplied by dozens or hundreds of cottages over many winters and summers, marked a significant breakthrough in frontier living circumstances. The improvement's mathematical actuality was simple, even though Jonas never calculated it exactly. 4 cords of wood were burned monthly in his first cabin. About 24 wires were needed for a 6-month heating season at the pace of 1 cord each day, which was equivalent to 24 days of hazardous, taxing labor. Upgraded cabin that required only approximately 9 cables and used about 1/5 cords per month. 9 days of employment rather than 24 over the same period. A 15-day discrepancy could be used for relaxing, hunting, trapping, or property improvement. The fuel efficiency also meant reduced deforestation surrounding the cabin. Communities where settlers and trappers congregated frequently displayed significant effects on cabins that consumed less wood, eased the pressure on the nearby forests caused by everyone cutting firewood. Forests nearer to settlements lasted longer, and the cumulative effect was apparent over time in several cabins. Longer. Finding enough lumber didn't need as much travel. The connection between building efficiency and environmental impact, even though it wasn't talked about in those words at the time. Other mountain men and trappers who frequently came to Jonas's cabin wanted to know the precise measurements. How thick? How much thermal mass should be in the fireplace? How big should the double wall be? And what ratios should be used for the chinking mixture? Jonas always provided estimates since he had discovered that more important than precise specifications knowing the fundamentals. Depending on the situation, a double wall could be 18 or 30 inches. On time and materials available, the mass of the fireplace had to be substantial. However, the chinking recipe could change depending on the cabin's size and the quality of the stone that is available. This adaptability was essential for disseminating the methods, depending on what resources were actually accessible. If Jonas had demanded precise requirements that called for particular supplies, or less individuals might have used his techniques if he had taught the underlying logic of trap air measurements. He made it possible to insulate, store heat in mass, and plug gaps to stop drafts. Others to modify the methods according to their own circumstances. A trapper in a different valley with distinct resources. The construction time frame was another way that materials may successfully use the same ideas. Practically speaking, Jonas worked alone for the majority of a summer to construct his upgraded cabin, which was a substantial time commitment, particularly for trappers who had to be out manning their trap lines. Due to time constraints, trappers would construct their cabins in phases, using a rudimentary framework. Improvements the second year, refinements the third, and the first summer. This methodical approach required living in a originally less than ideal cabin, but it was more useful than attempting to construct everything flawlessly from the beginning. Jonas frequently stated that the most crucial upgrades were to ensure appropriate chinking to prevent drafts. The fireplace should be positioned to maintain thermal mass within the insulated shell, and a raised floor should be constructed to stop the ground cold from moving upward. These three adjustments alone produced significant effects, and may be completed rather rapidly. Additional advantages were provided by the saw roof, double walls, and other improvements, but needed additional time and supplies. The construction season also played a role. Most trappers could only construct during the comparatively brief mountain summer, which lasted from June to September, working effectively and giving priority to the most crucial components. Jonas suggested beginning with the floor and foundation, getting the building weatherproof before winter arrives, followed by the walls and roof. Arrived. The next summer could see improvements like adding a sod layer to the roof or enhancing the chinking. A sturdy axe, a saw, and an auger were among the few tools needed, which helped disseminate the skills if needed. Most needs were met by a shovel, a draw knife for shaping wood, and a drill. No expensive materials or specialist equipment were needed. These were tools that any trapper would already have. The wood came from neighboring hillsides or creeks, while the stone for the fireplace came from the chinking materials. Clay, sand, moss, and grass were all readily available in the nearby woodlands, as was the lime, the one substance that might be difficult to obtain. Alternative materials could be used if needed. The Trapper Society conducted informal sharing through rendezvous meetings when trappers convened once a year to exchange goods. Furs and replenishment became into places where people could share building methods, news, and stories. A trapper who'd constructed a better hut, he would explain his work, and others would inquire, talk about changes, and argue. The advantages of various strategies. The data circulated over this oral network, changing and adjusting as it traveled from one place to another and from one area to another. Women in the mountain settlements frequently made their own, although their contributions to building design were rarely recorded in historical sources. Native American. Because of their own building traditions, women like Morning Crow were familiar with the fundamentals of thermal management. The spouses of pioneers and trappers contributed knowledge from their Eastern or European origins, often provided useful advice on how to make a cabin truly livable, such as light, storage requirements, and kitchen arrangement. Requirements, ventilation, and other factors that affected design choices even if they weren't addressed as specifically as the technical parts of heating and insulation. Children who grew up in these better cabins had a different frontier upbringing than those who grew up in subpar structures, having enough space to work inside, and being warm enough to sleep comfortably living in a building that didn't need continual upkeep while working on projects throughout the winter. These little health, education, and general well-being were all impacted cumulatively by improvements in day-to-day living situations. Instead of hiding under blankets in the winter, kids may pursue reading or math indoors. Keep warm,